Hello everybody, and welcome to part 4 in a series of videos I've put together for class on April 28th. Alright, so now that we've discussed the design of the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment, I just want to first go over what the officers did in the foot patrol areas relative to the comparison areas before I get into what actually happened with crime. So not only is it important to look at outcomes, such as whether crime was reduced or not, it's also important to look at outputs, or what officers actually did. And the reason we want to look at outputs is because it kind of gets into what's referred to as the black box. It kind of gives us an idea what mechanisms might be behind the crime reductions that we see if they do in fact materialize. So there's a couple of different outputs that were looked at during the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment. And one of those was arrests. So what was found was that in the 3 months prior to the experiment, in the comparison areas, there were 1,385 arrests. During the foot patrols in the comparison areas, and recall this is where the officers were not working, this was just standard policing, there were 1,361 arrests. And so you can see this is relatively flat, not much changed in the comparison areas from before to during the patrols. But we do see a pretty significant increase in arrests. So we started with 1684 before the patrols went out. That increased to 1905 during the experimental period. And so what we're seeing here is that these officers, these rookie officers, were working. And so we see an increase in arrests in the areas that were targeted, and this is especially apparent when we make a comparison to the control locations. Second output that was looked at was detected drug activity. And so this could be an officer making an arrest or writing a ticket for possession or use of any illicit substance. So what's found in that is that in the comparison areas there were 397 before the patrols. This actually went down in the comparison locations. However, if we look in the target areas, we see an increase from 464 up to 535. So again, we've got these officers who are increasing the amount of detected drug activity during the experimental period, during the patrols, relative to the comparison locations. Another output that was measured was pedestrian stops. And again, in the comparison locations, we're seeing that the volume remains relatively flat. 5965 before the patrols and 5985 during the patrols. And again, nothing's happening special here in the comparison locations. These are just getting standard policing. However, when we look at the areas that were targeted with foot patrol, we see a massive increase from over 7,000 to just over 12,000. And again, these are the areas that the officers were working. So we see a huge increase in pedestrian stops during the experimental period relative to these comparison locations. And so if we do in fact experience a violent crime reduction as a result of this experiment, one of the things that we'll be able to say is that it appears that an increase in pedestrian stops, that an increase in detected drug activity, and an increase in arrests could be contributing to why we see these reductions. And when you do the stats and you actually look at what happened in terms of violent crime from before to during the patrols, what we learn is that there was a 23% reduction in violent crime as a result of the foot patrol experiment. So if we look at the comparison areas, we see an increase in violent crime, and this makes sense because this is before the summer. This is the 3 months prior to the summer, and now during patrols is the 3-month summer period. So just as I mentioned in an earlier video, we tend to see spikes in violence erupt in Philadelphia and other major cities during the summer months. And so this is kind of verifying that fact. Right? We see that crime goes up. So again, nothing's happening special here. There's no special foot patrol initiative in the comparison locations. This is what we would expect to happen if nothing changed. And as I noted, we would expect to see an increase in violence during the summer. However, when we look at the areas that were targeted, contrary to what we would expect, given that this is the summer months, we see a reduction in violent crimes in the targeted areas, down from 359 to 306. And so what this suggests is that the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment was effective in preventing crime during the 3 summer months. And so to put this in percentage change, what we can say is that pedestrian stops, traffic stops, arrests, and detected drug activity all increased by varying degrees. Right, that 64% increase in pedestrian stops is perhaps the largest increase. And in terms of what happened, the outcome, we have a 23% reduction in violent crime, as well as a 12% reduction in vehicle-related crime. And I'm not going to get into the statistics, but we also learned that this was statistically significant. Right? In other words, this reduction in violent crime did not happen by chance. And given the strength in the experimental design, we can be confident in the fact that the reductions in crime that materialized were a result of the officers working in foot in the hotspots that they were assigned. And so in terms of the overall effect, and we can actually quantify changes in terms of the number of crimes that were prevented by using the weighted displacement quotient. And so a couple of things we can note after a weighted displacement quotient analysis. First of all, we get the weighted displacement quotient value. This doesn't really mean much in terms of what we want to convey to police practitioners. Were we doing this in class, I would go over the actual mathematical logic behind the weighted displacement quotient, but because students tend to get tripped up a little bit with that math, I'm going to not do that this semester given that we switched online. And so all I'll say about the weighted displacement quotient is that it's not really important for us to dig deep into. What we want to do, though, is look at the total net effect, and this is something that the weighted displacement quotient calculator that I mentioned and that we'll start using calculates for us. So in terms of quantifying changes in crime, we know that there were 90 fewer crimes in the treatment areas relative to the control locations. Right, so when we make a comparison in changes in the treatment areas relative to controls, we see that 90 crimes overall were reduced as a result of foot patrol. However, this was offset by 37 crime increase in the buffer zones. So recall those buffer zones that I went over in the previous video, we draw those to see whether crime goes up or down in these areas that are just outside of the areas that officers walked foot patrols. And what was found was that crime did go up in those buffer zones, which is indicative of potential crime displacement. In other words, offenders recognized that officers were working in the geographic locations that they were assigned, and as a result of that, they moved outside of those beats, yet they continued to commit crime. Right, so after taking into account the amount of crime that's displaced, what can be said is that overall, the net effect of the foot patrol experiment was a reduction of 53 violent crimes, or in other words, 53 fewer people were victimized with homicide, assault, robbery, and a number of other violent crimes. So the foot patrol experiment does appear to work. And since this study was published, there have actually been replication studies that also show that foot patrol, when conducted in violent crime hotspots, can reduce crime. So we do know that it works. And now, what I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to talk more about the weighted displacement quotient. I'll go over the calculator with you and talk about how these calculations were made. So this will become clearer. What I want to do is just spend 2 more minutes on looking at displacement and buffer zones, because these are not something that we discussed very much. I feel like treatment or target areas and comparison or control areas, right, those are pretty easy to understand. Treatment areas, officers worked on foot. Control areas, they did not work on foot. These locations just got policed the way they normally would. Buffer zones can be a bit confusing, so I just want to talk about displacement and buffer zones. So first of all, you might be asking yourself, well, why is a buffer zone only 2 blocks out from where officers worked? So let's say that this circle here, A, right, this is the hotspot that officers were told to go in and police. right? So we can look at the amount of crime that occurred in this hotspot, and we can, as we did, look for changes in the amount of crime from before to during the experiment. This circle B, right, the area between A and B, we would consider this the buffer displacement location. Now, why is this only 2 blocks? Well, theoretically speaking, we know that offenders do not travel very far to commit crime. Right? This is called the journey to crime, and we know that it's relatively short. We also know that offenders choose geographic locations to commit crime because they are conducive to crime. And so what that means is that this hotspot area A is probably a place that has lots of opportunities for crime. And those opportunities might be clustered or more concentrated here in this circle A. And if the opportunities are closed off because we put a police officer in that geographic location and crime goes down, what we expect is that offenders will, if they displace pretty close to where they were offending in the first place. And again, that's because we know that offenders do not travel very far to commit crime, and if there's a situation where their ideal offending location is closed off, they might move to nearby areas to seek out locations to offend. And so that's what displacement is, and that's the purpose of the buffer areas that were drawn. I think it's also important to point out that even if crime is displaced, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Right? If you think about, if we go back to the previous slide, overall 90 crimes were prevented in the places where the officers worked. There was only a 37 crime increase in the buffer locations. So even after taking into account displacement, we still prevented 53 violent crimes, or I should say the officers prevented 53 violent crimes in Philadelphia. So the displacement did not completely overwhelm the effect of the intervention itself. Right, so even if we have displacement where we have some offenders who choose to continue to offend and they do so nearby, it's also likely that the volume that they're offending is going to be less than what they would normally be doing in their ideal offending location. And that's because we know that opportunities to commit crime are not evenly distributed. And so therefore, even if an offender moves and continues to commit crime, it's likely and possible that the volume of crime that they commit is going to be reduced because the opportunities just aren't there. Right? Remember, they're probably offending here in the first place for a reason. Right? There's good opportunities. They can look for opportunities elsewhere, but if this is the best location, they move to the second best, which may be just outside of the areas they were offending in the first place. Those opportunities are likely to not be as prevalent, and therefore they're going to commit less crime than they normally would. So displacement is not necessarily a bad thing. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this video here. Before I do, I'll give you your third quiz question. And then in the next video, what I'll do is we'll start working with the weighted displacement quotient calculator, so I'll go over that with you, and we'll also start working in our Excel file with our data. Right, so, but in terms of the third quiz question, what I'd like you to do is tell me what spatial crime displacement is. And very simply, the answer to that question is when we have offenders that move from their ideal offending location because of officer presence or some other intervention and start offending elsewhere, right? Other geographic locations, right? That's what spatial displacement is. All right, I will see you in the next video. As I said, you can start pulling up your weighted displacement quotient calculator workbook that's on Blackboard, and we'll start there in the next video.